I realized in watching some of my recent videos that some of the things that I talk about may be taken out of context. For instance, I was thinking about something that I had said in one of my videos, um, and actually something I had said in several of my videos about how sometimes when you open up to, you know, when you open up inside, sometimes some negative feelings can come up, and it may not be everyone's experience to have that to have that happen. But what I generally mean by that is usually this is when somebody is going through what we would call a sensory symptoms, something along those lines. For me, it was triggered by a very powerful kind of spiritual understanding that basically I wasn't my mind, I wasn't my thoughts, I wasn't the identity that I had been habituated to believe myself as. And when I came into that understanding, that realization, um, what fundamentally happens is that that old person and that thought construct that you are kind of subconsciously and maybe unknowingly holding in place in your mind starts to drift through, starts to pass through your body and your physiology. And it's because what it essentially is just like any other thought or any other sensation. But for whatever reason, and you can go quite deep into this if you're interested, but for whatever reason, we tend to hold on to certain thoughts more than others. There are a lot of thoughts and sensations that arise in our experience, and they tend to just pass on through in their own time, as is natural. But then there are certain thoughts about ourselves, and we create this identity, and we kind of sometimes we create like this external, almost like an objective kind of abstraction as to who we are. And it's typically based on what other people tell us, how we compare to people on the television, how we compare to the people around us. And it typically is not based in completeness. It's more based in trauma response and coping mechanisms and trying to fit in with something that, um, as children, maybe we didn't conform to so neatly. And it's kind of a learned response. It's something that you kind of fall into as you grow older, and you start to realize that not everybody's going to accept you as you truly are. So you kind of put on this external layer to try and kind of protect yourself, and you start to create these kind of no-go zones, as you may hear them called at times, these kind of no-go zones where you don't let people in, so easily. It's basically a protection mechanism. You put on a suit of armor, and you put on a suit of, this kind of thing, and you encapsulate yourself in this kind of projection. Okay? And you project yourself out like, you know, even though you may not feel happy inside at times, you still put on a smile and you still try to fit in. You say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And you go through the motions. And this is something that, everybody does. Really, it's just a part of life in some way. Even if you don't identify so heavily in this kind of thing, still there's going to be times where, there's going to be times where you meet new people and you're going to feel the compulsion to make small talk and to, kind of play it safe, kind of dip your feet in the water a little bit before you go swimming. And it's just a way of breaking the ice, as we say, and to try and, um, not just to jump into, like, you don't just completely share everything about yourself with the first person you meet, because not everybody's comfortable with that. And it also opens you up to misinterpretations, and sometimes it's just easier to kind of play it safe. But inevitably, the thing that happens is that when you get too identified in this, and this brings me back to my original point about how when this protection mechanism, this armor starts to fall away, and And you realize that it's just too much of a burden to carry any longer, especially as you're growing and you're broadening in your understanding. You realize that, this old sense of myself, this old kind of, this old costume that I would wear, and this person I would pretend to be is actually becoming more of a burden and a hindrance to my growth than it used to be. Because for a time, sometimes it seems to encourage you. It encourages your growth. It helps you navigate certain social scenarios in life, and it helps give you a sense of greater confidence where otherwise you might not be confident in yourself. But you start to realize that it comes with limitations. It comes with certain conditions that oftentimes can be quite unhealthy. And so when this starts to fall away, you remember who you really are because, you never really stop being who you are underneath. That's kind of the big point to all of this, is that, you can pretend to be something that is more socially acceptable. You can pretend to be something that's more um, conducive to the expectations of, say, maybe your parents or your teachers or authority figures in the society at large. But basically you will never stop being who you are underneath all of that. And there's a lot of different directions you can take that in now, but because that's a rabbit hole all on its own. But basically the point of this discussion, the point of this video is to show, just to put some of the videos that I've made into a greater context, and this can serve maybe as an introduction to some of the things that I talk about. Because, when that thought construct, that imaginary self, starts to kind of pass through, it starts to maybe erode, you start to see some cracks in the pavement, or so to speak. Well, what can happen is that a lot of the energies that are being held down underneath the weight of that construct start to come up to the surface. And oftentimes those energies they're stagnant energies because they haven't really been allowed to kind of, you know, to be expressed fully. So they can be stuff like, there can be anger and fear and resentments, judgments, doubts, these kind of things, which really are just another part of life. They're really not something that we should spend so much time trying to push away or sweep under the rug, because basically these are just when you take the free flowing energy of life and you hold it down in a way that's maybe not natural for it to be held in, and you kind of keep it from flowing and bubbling up like a spring or like water would naturally flow. You basically hold it down because you need to keep it together, so to speak. You need to have a certain degree of emotional stability in order to interact with people. And there's certain things that are just taboo in our society, and there's certain things that we don't express openly with one another. And so these kind of energies, what happens is they tend to get kind of held down underneath the weight of conditioning, underneath the weight of belief, underneath the weight of just fear itself, oftentimes. And so when these things start to come up, it can be quite surprising. It can be quite shocking. And you'll notice you have judgments and fears and resentments that can come up in your mind, and you observe them from this truer place inside of yourself, and you go, oh my goodness, oh my. Like, who is saying this? What is this? What is this really about? And it is basically stagnant energy coming to the surface, and it can appear strong sometimes because basically it's been held down for a number of years in most cases. And so when it does come up, it's like, something, it's kind of like, if you have something that's like rotting or decomposing, you have that in a container. There's not a lot of airflow in there, and when you open up the container, there's an odor. It can, whoa, really kind of hit you. It can be a bit oppressive to your senses. And sometimes these energies, these traumas, and these fears and these pains, that are held underneath the weight of conditioning, they can have that effect. Like it hits you like an odor, and it's like, oh my God, oh. And sometimes the tendency is to want to go back to holding, no, 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 keep that down, keep it down. But you realize that once this process begins, this stuff starts flowing out, and you see this very clearly. You start to develop a broader understanding because you're going through this process. And you're seeing these energies, that these energies aren't supporting your growth. In fact, they're actually a result of maybe you being root bound in this analogy. Like when you're root bound, a plant is root bound, the soil gets soggy and the roots can actually start to mold and not be so healthy. So this is kind of indicative of that kind of thing where, you've grown to a certain point and now you need to be transplanted out of your old identity and put into the soil of being, because the soil of being is much wider and it encompasses all things and all things grow from it. And in fact, the soil that was originally taken out of the soil of being and then put into this limited pot of conceptualization, this limited pot of personal identity, or of just a limited sense of self, that soil actually came from the being to begin with. That's why the conceptual identity, just like in a pot that's full of soil, can still encourage growth and can still um, imitate the soil of being, but it can only do so for so long before you must be taken out and back into your origin, back into your original state. And what inevitably happens is you go through a process, and you go through this process where you're kind of in a mixed state. You've got, it's like you have one foot in the old identity and one foot in the unknown, in the new, and in the back into this greater space of being. And it's just like with when you do transplant actual plants out of their pots into the soil. There's a period of time where sometimes the plant doesn't look like it's doing so well, you know, because you can't really see what's happening underneath. You can't really see what's going on behind the scenes because the what generally happens, especially as the plant gets has a lot of foliage and it's even maybe bearing fruit by the time you need to transplant it. Um, Sometimes that foliage will start to wither and the fruits will start to die, this is a perfect analogy for what we as people go through when we come out of that conceptual identity. Because sometimes we feel like we're not being as productive, we're not bearing as much fruit as we used to. But what's really happening is it's not that there's less energy. There's actually more energy in your life now. You have more potential, more space in which to grow. It's just that that energy now has to come back into the roots. It has to come back into your root being and heal those roots and let those roots expand out through the soil and give you a greater grasp, literally a greater grasp of this being, of this soil, of this new space in which you're growing. And then once that happens, just like with the plants that we transplant into the soil, all of a sudden you start seeing this new growth, new greenery. It's fresh and vibrant, and it starts to grow up and produce flowers and sweet fragrances. And you start to notice that your persistence and your faith in this transition is paying off, and it will always pay off. And this is basically the whole context for everything that I've essentially talked about on this channel is to do with this transition and to do with this process. So this is, and essentially, if you are going through this process, or if you have similar processes to this, because everybody is at their own stage of growth. And for a time, we go from smaller pots to a medium-sized pot to a larger pot, and that's kind of like expanding your idea of who you are and creating a better self-image. And then eventually, you come to the point where you don't have any need of pots anymore. You don't need to conceptualize yourself anymore. You don't need to have abstractions about yourself anymore. The soil of being, the presence of being is it surpasses all of that.